Welcome to Engaging Cities Fireside Chats. On each episode of the show, I talk to leaders who are paving the way in civic engagement in order to inspire listeners and share strategies that you can implement in your own community. This podcast is proudly supported by our sponsor, Conveo, the engagement platform for plans and policies. Check them out at konveo.com. I'm your host, Kelly Hickler, the Community Manager with Engaging Cities, as well as the founder of Season1 Studio, which is dedicated to innovative civic education and engagement. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Larry Schooler, and I have to tell you, I've been taking German lessons, so anytime I see a name or word that looks remotely German, I want to pronounce it with a German accent. So I keep wanting to say Dr. Larry Schooler, but I'm keeping myself under control. It is Schooler. Larry is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches courses in conflict resolution, facilitation, leadership, and communication. Our conversation today is focused on the nuances of facilitating effective community dialogues when designing public memorials, using the Virginia Beach Memorial and the Pulse Orlando Memorial that Larry is working on as examples. Now, before my conversation with Larry, I knew virtually nothing about the process of creating memorials. But now I know that there is a huge role for community input. So even if you're not working on a memorial specifically, the insights that Larry gives are relevant to any sensitive or maybe controversial project. He talks about the importance of a consensus-driven approach that allows room for storytelling and fosters understanding of the community's historical context, especially holding space for existing grievances. There are a lot of useful insights in here, so let's get into it. All right. Hey, Larry, how are you? Good to have you on the podcast today.
Great to be with you, Kelly. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So,
Sure.
Larry, why don't you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself and your background and the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, well, I'm a father of two and a husband of one. I'm living in Austin, Texas, where I teach right near the place over my shoulder there at the University of Texas in the Moody School of Communication, where I mainly teach courses on conflict resolution and facilitation and some that have to do with public engagement. I've spent the last, probably 17 years in and around the fields of public engagement, starting when I was an employee at the city of Austin, the municipal government here in town. And I was able to take on a role that was newly created to manage public engagement across the organization. And luckily, the city eventually saw the light and realized that that's not a one-person job. And so they have since hired a lot of other folks to do that. But really have enjoyed my journey through this field and, have gotten to now work with a number of different other municipalities and federal agencies and even state agencies and nonprofits, just in that field of consensus building and community dialogue and deliberation and public participation. And so now I do that on my own. And then, as I say, separately teach at the university.
Yeah, that's quite an impressive resume that you have.
Thanks. Yeah, it was actually a career pivot, to tell you the truth. I mean, I started out of college working for NPR for about 7 years. So I was really interested in journalism and in radio in particular. And so I've really, at that point, felt like, I was aiming for the top microphone in Washington or something. And then just kind of got to a place where I realized that maybe I wanted to be a little bit more a part of what I was reporting on than just reporting on it. And so got an opportunity within city government, and the rest is sort of history.
Oh, that's so cool. I did not know that about you.
Got a face for radio, Kelly, as your viewers and listeners will see. And no, but I mean, it was a great experience. I mean, I miss it, especially when I listen to great work on the network and, still have friends there. I think that actually the more I've gotten to reflect, the more I've seen a through line between some of the work I did as a reporter and some of the work I'm doing now, because I really was striving as a reporter to make sure that um, less often heard voices were heard, and that the reports that I was doing had perspectives from multiple sides, that it wasn't just the loudest voice or the most powerful. And so now that I'm in this field, it's always been my aim to give everyone affected by a decision the opportunity to affect that decision. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of, thought to make that happen.
Yeah.
And so, I feel like some of what I did in journalism is rubbed off on what I'm doing in this part of my life.
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting. I always love hearing people's stories of how they got into to what they're doing now, whether it's city planning or community engagement work. It's so interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, mine was kind of accidental in that sense, because when I initially onboarded at the city, it was to be an aide to one of our elected officials. And so there wasn't anything in and of the job description itself that really would have required that I learn how to do this stuff. But what I found was this particular elected official was a little bit introverted, and he wasn't the kind of person who really wanted to spend a lot of time, you know, out and about with his different interest groups. He really wanted to work on policy, and he was very good at policy, but he wanted me to be the one to kind of do the shuttle diplomacy, if you will, between these different sides to get some
Mm.
policy passed. And so, my trial by fire was on, municipal stuff like environmental protection and street closures and, affordable housing and stuff like that. But I didn't have a title or any training associated with it. And so
Okay.
after about a year and a half, I said, let me go get some training, because this
Yeah.
is interesting, but I don't want to keep doing it without that.
Yeah, now I'm thinking I need a side podcast that's just about people's stories of how they got into working in local
Totally.
government. Oh
Totally.
my
Yeah.
goodness.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was never on my radar screen when I was in college or as a young person to work in local government, or really to work in government. I mean, I may have thought about, some of the elected office kinds of things, but I mean, I never would have thought of local government as being a place that I would find such a home professionally. But, I'm just always amazed at what local government can do and does do, way beyond what I think most people assume it does. So it's a cool spot to be in.
Absolutely. So when I reached out to you to invite you to the podcast and you were telling me some of the projects that you might like to talk about, the one that really struck me was this Pulse Orlando Memorial. I'm really interested to hear about that project and what your role was. So maybe give our listeners just kind of a high level overview of what that is and maybe a reminder of what happened there.
Yeah, sure. So this takes us back to 2016, June 12th of 2016, when a gunman opened fire at a nightclub that was called Pulse. And when all was said and done, he claimed 49 victims and a slew of others who were wounded, some very seriously. Um, and you know, it's such a uh, it's such a hard to process incident in a lot of ways, not least of which just the sheer number of victims. But also, I think it involves so many strange kinds of intersections of American identity, including Latin American and LGBTQ plus in particular. There were, obviously heterosexual victims. There were white and African American victims, but there was a significant subset that was both from Latin America, particularly Puerto Rico, and that identified as LGBTQ plus. And so that obviously made the event somewhat stand out from the very unfortunate tally of mass shootings that we've experienced in our country. And so I think there was a lot of interest. And President Obama, came to Orlando pretty quickly after the incident. I know from the conversations I've had there that, people around the world were reaching out to Orlando in the aftermath, because it just was such a shocking incident. And for quite some time appeared to have been targeted at one or both of those populations. It's hard to know exactly what was in the shooter's mind, obviously. But I think what was interesting was that a foundation sprung up called the One Pulse Foundation that was designed to kind of orchestrate a memorial to the massacre, to the tragedy. And for a lot of different reasons, they weren't able to do that. The foundation just wasn't able to put the money and the ideas together and get the thing built. And um, I learned about that at the end of last year. I happened to have a former client who was doing some work with that foundation. Just a strange coincidence that that was the case. And so she and I spoke, and part of what I talked to her about was the work I had done with Virginia Beach, Virginia's 531 Memorial, which is similar in that it was a mass shooting that affected, large parts of a municipality. And to make a very long story short, that led the city of Orlando to ask me to, come help them with the process of co-creating a vision for a memorial to Pulse some, 8+ years now after the original incident.
Okay, so it's the city who spearheaded this
Yeah,
memorial.
they kind of had to take over. I mean,
Yeah.
the One Pulse Foundation basically dissolved. It just sort of
Mhm.
ceased to exist, and so the city acquired property where the Pulse still actually stands. It's not operational, but the city owns the property, and they just sort of took it upon themselves to help see this process through. And it's interesting
Mhm.
because as you look across the country, you do find a mix of kind of public conveners and more foundation based conveners of processes like this. And it kind of depends on the circumstances and the profile of the event and so forth. I know, there have been events, for example, in El Paso, Texas, there was a shooting at a Walmart that most people probably heard about at the time, that the memorial was overseen by Walmart because it took place on their property and they felt it
Mhm.
was, critically important to get something built quickly.
Mhm.
Whereas places like Las Vegas uh, and Virginia Beach have done it, through public sector conveners. So in this case, it was a little bit of an accident or a shift, an audible the line of scrimmage, but the mayor's taken the lead here in trying to convene the conversation and to get this memorial built.
I see, okay. So what was your role exactly?
Well, the truth of the matter is, my role is kind of just beginning. So I was brought on to work on this project in April of
Okay.
this year, and it's the first time in my career that I feel as much noticed on a project, frankly, because given how long people have been waiting,
Mhm.
there's a lot of um, anxiousness, anxiety to get going. And
Mhm.
so there's a little bit of a mystery around, well, who is this, guy from Texas and what is he going to offer to us, to do the process? And I think, part of the work that I needed to do in the early going was convene some focus groups, particularly with family members of the victims, to understand what had transpired up to now and what they wanted to see happen during a subsequent process of community and stakeholder engagement. And one of the things that I think is complicated about this, beyond just the need for, say, English and Spanish at all meetings and reaching people that are well outside of the greater Orlando area,
Mhm.
I think another complexity is with any project like this, you're sort of working at the behest of the people most deeply impacted, while at the same time knowing that your work will have an impact well beyond that set of families. So, I mean, here you have obviously 49 families with untold numbers of relatives of those families who all have particular points of view on what they want this memorial to be or how they want their own loved one to be memorialized. But then
Right.
you have survivors, you have people who, by the grace of God survived, but were shot or were otherwise traumatized, critically at the
Mhm.
scene. You have first responders who deal with their own process. And we had a first responder on our committee in Virginia Beach. Then you have people who may just think of themselves as a community leader, um, in one of the communities that was impacted, even if it's just the Orlando community, but it could be the LGBTQ plus community, the Latino
Mhm.
community. um, And so they feel it based on their affiliation, or maybe someone was a patron of the club, the Pulse Club, nightclub, multiple times. And I've heard many people describe it as a safe place, kind of a sanctuary for people who identified as LGBTQ plus. So that just, I think, makes it all the more important that the process of engagement be done in a very thoughtful and sensitive way. And the biggest step we've taken so far is to put a committee together that's meant to be broadly representative of those different interests, and that committee is going to start meeting next week. So that'll be a big
Oh,
moment
wow.
for us.
Okay. So how many people did you invite?
Well, that's a good question because I mean, obviously we had an application process that was open to the public. I shouldn't say obviously. We had an application process that was open to the public,
Okay.
and we ended up with, I want to say, about 155 applications, which
Hmm.
is pretty extraordinary,
Yeah.
given how heavy this topic is. That many people would want to put in the emotional labor to do this work was really kind of inspiring to me, and it obviously made it difficult then for the mayor's office to narrow that down to a more manageable number. They actually did something that I'd like to see more communities do, which is they drew upon 4 community members as kind of like advisors, and they reviewed all the applications with the names
Sure.
redacted so that they didn't just pick friends of theirs, but they really dug into the quality of the applications and also the significance of the perspectives and the mix, and came up with a slate that then the mayor's office was able to turn into a collection of nominees. So when it was all said and done, 18 people were invited, 18 people accepted, and that'll make up our committee that begins their meetings next week.
Okay. And how often, or I guess, how many times total and how often will that committee meet?
It's a good question. I've initially pegged it at a monthly meeting between now and December. And when I say monthly meeting, I learned from Virginia Beach that this isn't the kind of thing you meet for an hour once a week about. You really have to give yourself the space to, emotionally process both, in between meetings, but also during. You're not just going to jump right into a topic like this, after a
Mhm.
long day at work. And so next week, we're going to meet on 2 consecutive evenings for the better part of the evening, and then take a few weeks off and come back. So at the moment, it would be 6 monthly meetings, but as with any public engagement process, you have to be willing to adapt and pivot based on how things are shaping up. The other thing that's interesting is that we decided to have a community meeting directly following the second day of the committee meeting. And the thinking there was, some community members will not want to go and do sort of public comment the way that we're all accustomed is, difficult for a lot of people to do.
Right.
And they would rather speak informally or write their comments down. And
Mhm.
so we've programmed kind of a flexible formatted event, an open house style event for right after the committee adjourns, uh, for people to be able to kind of tackle some of the same questions that the committee itself is going to deliberate on immediately prior to that. So that'll be interesting to see how both folks in person and folks
Mhm.
who share some input virtually uh,
Mhm.
will respond to that.
Okay. So this meeting that's happening after, it's gonna be a hybrid, or that one's
Not
just gonna be
not really. Yeah, the meeting
okay.
that's after is an open house, but we're going to try to replicate the questions posed at the open house in a virtual way. So you've probably seen
Okay.
those virtual open houses where
Mhm.
you're sort of scrolling through the page, and there's different parts where you can kind of linger and make comments. So we don't know exactly the look and feel of it yet, but the goal
Okay.
is for someone particularly who lives out of town, to be able to similarly comment on the parts of this that are, most important to them.
To change my questions up a little bit, since you're still working, like, it's just unfolding
Yeah.
now.
I don't know
Um,
if it's helpful. We could also talk about Virginia Beach since it's completed. I don't know that that's
okay.
helpful to you, but you just tell
Yeah.
me how you'd like to
Yeah, I think
to
that might be interesting to talk about that. And then what parts of it you're replicating? Because some of the questions I had were like, what worked really well
Yeah,
and what would you recommend for others? So maybe you could talk about Virginia Beach and what worked well there, what you're gonna replicate for this
absolutely.
process, and then also, like, lessons learned, things that you learn from that you'll do differently
Yeah,
now. I think that could be interesting to use that example, but also talk about Orlando as, as something that you're currently working on so people can see how your mind works, like, as
sure.
you're as you're
Yeah,
undertaking a
absolutely.
project.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think, it's certainly become clear to me that when you're working on a project like this, yes, you may end up using some approaches to engagement that you've used in the past, but you kind of almost have to, like almost erase memories that you have of using those before, because
Hmm.
what you're doing here with this conversation is so radically different from anything else that I think we typically engage the public on. Now, obviously, we talk about policing and we talk about, you know, housing affordability. And I mean, we definitely talk about issues that arouse passion. There's no question.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but I don't know how much more sensitive you get than something like this. And so that's, I think, one of my takeaways is, a lot hinges not just on the methodology of the engagement event, but on the
Mhm.
way the questions are specifically being asked. Because I
Mhm.
think,
Right.
especially when it comes to what I'll call public art, and I know this may seem like a funky way to describe it, but I mean, it is a public, you know, space and the design of it. A lot of times people really reflexively, they want to just respond to whichever picture, moves them. And I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, obviously that matters. Aesthetics matter. But I think in this case, one of the things that I learned from Virginia Beach that we're bringing to Orlando is to start sort of at a basic level about what memorials mean to people and what they are meant to achieve and accomplish. Because you could have a memorial, for example, that is all about the documentation of what took place on that spot. And one of the most remarkable things about the Virginia Beach Memorial is that they will not tell you the story of the shooting. They will tell you the stories of the people who died, their life
Mhm.
stories, but they will not be telling you the stories of the tragedy. And that was a decision that, was reached by consensus by this committee with input from the families. Um, but I think that, in order to get into that conversation, as I say, it's really important to think about fundamentally what do we want this memorial to do for the different audiences that it's meant to serve, not just families, not just survivors, not just first responders, but
Mhm.
an unborn child 30 years from who
Mm.
has never heard of this. I mean, I
Yeah.
happen to be I happen to be in Dallas today, and I made my way out of downtown, and I passed the Sixth Floor Museum, which is, in memory of the assassination of President Kennedy. And I had to sort of catch my breath for a moment, realizing, of course, what we've been through here recently. Um, and I wondered whether the crowds that I was seeing there were, you know, larger based on what had just taken place. But
Mm.
that's
Mhm.
that's a memorial with a very specific kind of historic documentarian sort of purpose. And I think that for some communities, what they're looking for is a way to heal. And sometimes being confronted with the story and with artifacts associated with the tragedy contradicts that goal,
Mm.
contravenes it in some way. And so I think it's really important to not jump immediately into blank canvas. What does our memorial need to look like? But instead to kind of come at it from the perspective of what does this memorial need to do for the people who visit it, and by extension, what are some of the needs that the different audiences will have who visit it? Because again, that 8-year-old who wasn't alive when this happened has a
Mhm.
different set of needs than the mother whose daughter was killed at Pulse,
Mhm.
and we need to cater to both of those. And so I just don't know of many projects like this in that way. Obviously, we all do
Right.
planning projects that are looking at a future vision for community and so on. But I think this is a little bit different, because I think we often are thinking out a horizon that we're all going to be alive to experience. Maybe our kids will be more of the leaders of the community, but we're all thinking, well, okay, this is our future. Um, this, I think, is meant to last even longer than that, and so that really plays in and plays into and influences the way I try to ask the questions of the community.
Yeah, this is so fascinating to me because I have to be honest, memorials are not something that I'm familiar with the process of creating those. I just assume there's some committee somewhere who specializes in memorials, and I never thought of the public being involved in the creation. And I'm wondering now, like the 9/11 memorial site, I'm really not even familiar with I've been to it myself, but I'm not familiar with the process that was used to create it. Now I'm so curious. I'm thinking through all the different memorial sites that are throughout the US or the world, and I'm wondering, oh gosh, how are those created and how often is the public involved in that?
Well, and you asked me about, takeaways from doing this before with Virginia versus Orlando. And I mean, one thing I would just say is that no two communities, no two memorials are going to approach it the same way. And
Mhm.
that's why I took, the better part of 2 months to try to assess what would work best for this community. And I recommended a committee in large part because the number of families is so large. You really cannot physically get them all into one room, not because of
Mhm.
fire marshal, but because of where they all live.
Mhm.
So, um, it just seemed to me like having a broadly representative body that could dive more deeply would be beneficial. And there have been committees across a lot of these memorials, particularly the ones that have had such a high profile. But there have been other situations, even in the greater Central Florida area, the greater Orlando area. A memorial went up near Kissimmee that I don't think had any committee at all. It was basically
Mm.
just an artist's inspiration and
Oh,
some
okay.
consultation with the governmental entity that controlled the property, and then it went up. So I really don't think it's a one size fits all. And then the other thing I was thinking of is one of the things Virginia Beach taught me, at least, was this may or may not, in the farther aftermath of the event, be something that an average person in that community feels the need to weigh in on. I think in the immediate aftermath, oftentimes because attention is so heightened, uh, you may get an uptick in interest from community members as to what should be there, where it should go, what it should
Mhm.
look like. Um, but generally, the best practices are to not even really start a conversation about a memorial till at least 6 months or a year after the incident for a number of reasons, including the grieving process and how long that takes and how differently it goes for everybody. So when we did Virginia Beach, we didn't see as much in the way of general community input, but we saw an intense amount of family input and a desire to influence the shape that this took. And there were two family members who served on the committee, but there were another, 10 families plus who were contributing from afar, but did so very intently on a regular basis through our team. So that's different. I mean, obviously most of the time we wouldn't necessarily metaphorically handhold stakeholders like that, but you
Okay.
have to in this case. And
Yeah.
I'm going to be speaking directly with all the families that have asked to be involved here because they obviously matter a great deal. So I think it's not necessarily as simple as saying, stakeholder engagement is more important here than community or something, but it is, I think, different in the way that it impacts people than, say, other kinds of initiatives that a municipal government would seek to undertake.
Okay. In your work on Virginia Beach, were there any kind of lessons learned or things that you may have done differently or that will help inform your approach to Orlando?
One of the things I have to always remind myself of is that we were actually still coming out of the pandemic, and I wore a mask at the first meeting. And, not that that necessarily had a huge impact on the way we did things, but I can't ignore that. And I know that that probably influenced a lot of people to decide against coming to any of the in-person offerings that we provided, for example, and err on the side of, a survey or something like it. Now, people did come, but it wasn't a crowd. When our committee met, it didn't attract a crowd. And, um, but more people did take the asynchronous survey. So I think
Hmm.
that's important. Um, one unique thing here is that the site for the memorial in Orlando is fixed. It is meant for the site where the nightclub is still physically standing. In Virginia Beach, they had to figure out where to put it, and that was a
Mm.
substantial a part of the discussion. So, that's a little bit of a lesson learned just in terms of the relevance of place and the significance of place, placement, especially in this conversation. I also, though, think that I stayed very faithfully tied to a consensus-based process as compared to a, parliamentary one or a Robert's Rules of Order type process. And I think that was critical. I think that had things come to a vote, um,
Mm.
community division would have been much more the story. Not that there was a tremendous amount of dissension in the ranks, but just, you take a vote, people lose the vote,
Mhm.
and there's dissatisfaction and a little bit of a sour taste. And I understand we have to take votes, city council and Congress and all that, but I think this was a process that really lent itself to consensus, and I think um, we're giving ourselves, I think, the time and the space to work to get there. And I think that that will be something very valuable to have as this memorial gets erected. So I'd say those are big ones, and then um, just really being proactive in the communication with the families and the key stakeholders, because you don't want folks to hear about something getting decided without having heard about it directly and getting to weigh in. This is just one of those things where um, you can't short shrift that part of the process. So I think we'll
Right.
we'll bear that in mind for sure.
Okay. Can you talk through a little bit more about how a consensus process is different than a voting type process?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that you're striving to arrive at a decision as a group that everyone feels comfortable either actively supporting, or at least they're willing to mute any kind of opposition to it. In other words, that they can live with it is the popular way of saying it. Um, but I think it's important that, when you have a potential solution that has some support, some opposition, that you drill down and look for ways to address the concerns of the opposition in such a way that they then could be comfortable. And it may mean abandoning that idea, entirely. I mean, you have to, I think, have some way to assess how widespread the support for a particular idea is. So, that may be red, yellow, green, like green, I'm totally supportive. Yellow, I think I
Mhm.
can support it. Red, I'm totally against it or
Mhm.
um, so you have to have some way to assess it, but I think the biggest thing is the need for creativity on the decision making and the solution development,
Mhm.
meaning that you can't just go with the thing that'll get majority. You need to go with something that everybody feels will satisfy their underlying interests. And so, as a facilitator, you know, I'm encouraging a lot of divergent kind of brainstorm thinking and convergent thinking that um, aligns the decision making with the things that each of the committee members tell me are their core interests. So in a committee like this, you have, appropriate remembrance of a relative, that tells their story, that gives them, specialness or whatever. You may have, um, someone that's more about kind of the iconic nature of a memorial and the visibility, to people beyond the community where it sits. You have to consider things like durability and security, for the whatever's there so that
Right.
it's preserved. So when you're looking at potential solutions, you're not just saying, well, that'll never work, or that's not a good idea, or it's been tried. You're saying, will it address the things that we've said as a group are important to us? And so that's part of what that mission development at the beginning can achieve, because you're
Okay.
sort of laying a marker and saying, this is what we hope this memorial will achieve. And then as we put a
Hmm.
design together, we can say, does this, you know, put that mission forward, or cause it, a problem?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for explaining that a little bit more. Um, I don't know if this is too big of an ask, but can you think of some takeaways or some strategy that listeners could apply to other types of projects? Because I think, I mean, hopefully it's rare to have a memorial project in your city. I maybe some listeners will be undertaking that, but I don't know how common that is to work on that type of project. So I wonder if there's any takeaways that could apply to other types of project, like other types of sensitive or highly
Sure.
controversial projects.
Well, it's interesting because when I think about kind of the small little portfolio of work that I've been doing in this space, one of the things that I include is uh, efforts to update a historic preservation plan for the city of Austin. They called it an equity based historic preservation plan update. And so, as the name kind of suggests, that was really a conversation about how to preserve the memory of not just structures important to populations that weren't as heard from before, but also potentially to preserve parts of local history that people would just assume forget. And I think certainly from the summer of 2020 forward, we've seen a pretty remarkable reckoning in almost all parts of the United States around what should be memorialized and how.
Mm, yeah.
Um, and so to me, that's certainly of a piece with everything we're talking about here. We're talking here about a specific incident that is hard for people to forget given the high profile nature of it. But to me,
Yeah.
there's a lot you can extrapolate about just the act of historic preservation. And, cities have a significant role to play. And I don't know how it works in other cities, but certainly Austin provides tax breaks to historically designated properties,
Mm,
and resources are expended to preserve those. And so it isn't just a matter of I get to put a plaque on my front of my building. It's really I'm going to impact the development in this area, and I'm going to expend some public resources. And
mm,
so I think that's something that has to be talked about collectively. What are the values that underpin that process?
mhm.
And then again, I think we've just, I think, come to appreciate as a nation how much of the story of our nation has been sort of glossed over, papered over. Not necessarily even in a museum, although I think many of our history museums do a fantastic job of telling stories that we don't learn as children in school. But I think there's a little bit of a difference in my mind between what's put in a museum, which is open to the public, but also kind of a privately administered space in most cases, and what goes in sort of town square, so to speak.
Sure. Right.
What do we give space to? The state of Texas, the capital where I live, nearby, went to the Supreme Court over a Ten Commandments monument on the grounds of the state capitol and prevailed. They also have a large monument that you can't miss when you first walk in that's to the Confederacy, of which Texas was a member.
Mm,
And there could be people who, find that objectionable. And there could be other people who say, I don't care what the message may seem to be by putting that there in this age. That's part of our history and we need to remember it. So
mm,
there's all sorts of questions that I think get raised or need to get raised associated with this. And I just don't think that our communities can take for granted that what's currently being memorialized is what the community wants memorialized, and or um, what needs to be memorialized that hasn't been, and maybe how certain memorials should be modified to make room for the memorialization of other events. So a lot there. I think that folks can hopefully connect to what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot to digest. But thank you
Probably
so
why I've
much.
had digestion. It's probably why I've had digestion issues, Kelly, in the
Yeah.
past. No.
I mean, these are not light topics. These are heavy topics to think through, and for you as a facilitator to facilitate this process, that's a lot of. I mean, do you go to a therapist or something?
Well, I'd be happy if we get HIPAA waived. I can go in. But
Yeah.
no,
I mean,
no, but it's funny. I mean, for one thing, we were talking about President Kennedy before, and one of his speeches, the one he gave at Rice University in the 1960s, has a line in it where he says, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Of course, he said it had, but not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And he goes on to explain why the hard things, matter. And I've always been very moved by that, and I think nothing significant happens in society and human existence without struggle. And so if I'm fortunate to be put in a position to impact that, um, that feels gratifying, I guess, fulfilling, like I'm putting whatever, training or skills or whatever to good use. I wanted to share though one interesting anecdote specific to that quote that kind of ties everything back together. So I was starting a facilitation in the Midwest. This is, I guess, a year or so ago. And this is the first time that this group was seeing me. I literally was just basically introducing myself. And I always put a lot of stock into the first moments of any facilitation. I don't like it to just be, good morning, everyone. I like it to have some energy, some attention
yeah,
grabbing.
yeah.
And so I opened with this quote from President, longer version of it. And this particular group was focused on tackling racial equity, addressing systemic racism and racial discrimination in their community. And later that day, after I had been finished, one of the people in that group shared with me how moon and space exploration were viewed by her community as a form of colonialism, as a form of sort of messing with, nature
Hmm,
and the creator's work, and just not applauded, not something
mhm.
to applaud, but rather something to kind of, back away from, not
Yeah.
partake of.
Wow. Okay.
And, that was a moment where I was at first just shocked and almost in disbelief
Mhm.
that something so, in my mind, kind of universal around tackling challenges and all would evoke that kind of reaction.
Yeah.
But that's I think a reflection of how complex dealing with our history is. You know, we all know that Thanksgiving feels a certain way to one population and differently to another
Sure.
population. Um, and countless other observances, will just be kind of manipulated, but just adapted,
Yeah.
to the particular needs of a particular group. And so I just think that we can't take for granted that whatever we've been raised on to believe about something is
Mhm.
going to be universally held, and that our use of an emblem like that, space exploration, the moon, etc., is going to land in the same way. So I guess my point is whether or not you're facilitating about historical items or not, um, you are likely to be hearing about history in the work that you're doing, because there will be people that come in
Mhm.
and have the, for lack of a better expression, baggage from mistakes that municipality or
Mm.
other government agency made in the past. And so
Yeah.
they can't necessarily jump right into some visioning process for the future without feeling seen and heard around the stuff that they didn't like took place long ago. So it can, I think, apply to a lot of different topics, because hardly anything that we want to get the public's input on uh, doesn't have a history in one
So,
form or another. So finding a way to harvest that, I think, can really be valuable to the public.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit more because I've seen that so many times in different public outreach processes where a consultant comes in or, the city comes in and they want to do a meeting about this one project. But there's members of the public who are still upset about something that happened in the past and they want to talk about that. And it's this interesting dynamic where
Yeah.
where you have the city or the consultant who's trying to keep it focused on, no, well, we're talking about this, but the community's not there yet. They're not ready to talk about that. They need to talk about this other thing first.
Yeah.
And I'm always I'm kind of at a loss sometimes of how to handle that situation.
Well, and I am too, because sometimes I have a mandate or a scope of work or a
Yeah.
deadline or some combination of those pressures, and so things like revisiting the past feel like an obstacle. Um, I guess I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is I think that more practitioners need to dig deeper into their assessment phase. And when I say that, I don't just mean desk research that can unearth some of that history. I mean, actually sitting down face to face with someone or on
Mhm,
video and
mhm,
letting them tell you about it. Not
yeah,
not to marginalize them, mind you, not to sort of say I don't want to hear this in a public meeting, but I'll hear about it on the sideline. But the more that I can glean from those conversations, the more that that can inform the way that I facilitate, not so much telling someone to be quiet, but from the jump, acknowledging something that everybody
mhm,
knows. So, for example, in Orlando, they will probably hear me say, um, this community has waited far too long to get to this moment. And many people have felt their voices were silenced and needed
mm,
to be heard. And that's what we're about tonight, something along that line, so that not someone will not repeat any of the history or what have you, or different angle on it, but just, yes, that's accurate. I feel heard. So I think that assessment really matters. And I also think, um, getting the client department or the client organization to give you enough bandwidth to spend some time on the front end
yeah,
with some of that. You know, the best way to kind of make that case, I think, is look, you can either make space for this on the front end or deal with adverse effects to your timeline later on. I
mhm,
don't think it's going to
yeah,
be buried and suppressed. It'll come
mhm,
out one way or the other. Better
yeah,
that it be harvested and harnessed in a way that benefits us
mhm,
than let it seep out in, you know, parts outside the process or frustrations
yeah,
with the process, which can certainly happen. I think, you are onto something for sure when you talk about the challenge that either a planner or a facilitator or some other government official faces when someone appears to be, launching into a longer story, and the
yeah,
purpose of the meeting is different. Um, And so I think that there is a place for a facilitator to be able to say um, something along the lines of, "Let me step in here for a second. I'm really appreciating the story that you're telling us, and I just wonder, can you help me understand exactly the way that this story connects to our conversation about Community Vision 2040 or whatever?" Because I think some people have the history that you have, some don't, but we
right,
really want to understand how to tie it into the particular project that we have. Now, some people will, you know, zealously hold on to the power and just ignore what I ask and just keep on going with whatever they want to talk about. But in my experience, they generally appreciate the fact that theirs is not the only voice in the room, and that in and of itself has to matter. because they feel strongly about themselves having a voice, but they often
Yeah.
also understand that others need that voice,
Yeah.
and that the more they tie it into the topic, the more relevant uh, it's going to be to the people putting together whatever they're putting together. So
Mhm.
it kind of feeds the interest, the underlying interest that they have of not just being heard, but being considered, uh, to have their voice and their stories be considered in the future work of planning or policy making or both. And so we kind of need to help them there sometimes, but I don't think we necessarily need to say, um, story time's over, for example.
Okay. Okay. Okay, one more question, I promise. The last question. This making me think of in-person versus online engagement, and when people are sharing their stories, how important is it for them to be in person in a group together, hearing each other at the same time versus an online setting, or even if, if it's on Zoom, like a live Zoom thing, or completely online where it's just making comments, filling out a survey, or making comments on a document that doesn't seem to lend itself to the storytelling as much and people hearing each other.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, I think, one of the quintessential issues of our field, and will probably continue to be so, especially in our post-pandemic world, where folks have begun to accept levels of synchronous live virtual participation to extents that we never had seen before. I remember in the early 20 teens when I was doing some of the kinds of stuff we're doing now, having people kind of look at me like I was from outer space. In terms of like, why do we need to televise a meeting and let people call in? Why is that important? And I'm not trying to hold myself up as any kind of prophet. I mean, I obviously had no idea what we were in for, but clearly there are people even who live in the same community where the meeting is happening who would just assume, log in and maybe not even show their face or use their
Mhm.
voice.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, I think that first of all, I think that we need to be cognizant of the power that the technology has to bring voices into the conversation that otherwise wouldn't be in it. So, in other words, there are people who may never be able or feel able or willing to physically come to a place to be part of a conversation. And I think our technology has reached a point where we can still provide that person with a metaphorical seat at the table for others to hear their story, for them to tell it, and for others to hear it.
Mm. Okay.
And that, it may vary what that looks like. I mean, obviously, we're having this conversation on a particular platform, and that
Mhm.
works for a lot of people, but it
Mhm.
won't work for everybody. And I
Mhm.
think we have to, tailor things to the audience that we're trying to reach. But I also think that, we've seen a lot of digital engagement platforms be very evolved in their thinking about what it looks like when someone engages online in a topic that we're trying to collect input about. I initially started working with Bang the Table almost 15 years ago, but I've seen, Social Pinpoint and Public Input and a number of others
Mm.
say we're not just a survey platform, and we're not even just a, map spatial kind of input platform. We're a space for dialogue in one form or another. And I
Mhm.
often find that I'm fighting an uphill battle with clients to get them to see the benefits of that threaded conversation that's being
Mm.
moderated on the
Okay.
page. But
Uh-huh.
that to me um, is one of the most important, components. And I mean, maybe it's because I'm a university professor now, and so I use Canvas that has discussion threads and
Yeah.
students commenting. But I just think there's so many voices that come to the table, and you and I know this, but what we would say in real time in response to a question is completely different than what we would say when we have the chance to compose it.
Yeah.
Not to mention writing it at 3 in the morning when the idea really comes to us as compared to 7 o'clock
Uh-huh.
at night or tired from work or what.
Yeah.
So, um, so there's all different reasons for us to leverage some of the capabilities of that technology to allow for storytelling. Now, will it be heard in the same way as if I hear, orally? Probably not. The reaction, the impact might be different, but it won't be nothing. And if someone's willing to be vulnerable, and if we're willing to kind of convene that space,
Mhm.
curate that space, so to speak, to allow for that, then I think it can bear enormous fruit. So I hope that people in the roles like mine will consider that. Will not just think it's either a one-way communication like a survey or a boisterous public meeting. uh, that they'll think about some of the in between possibilities as well.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, where can people find more information about whether it's Virginia Beach, Orlando, and then you personally, if they want to reach out to you and have questions, they want to hire you to facilitate their process?
Well, for me, I always direct people to either LinkedIn or to my University of Texas website. So if you Google me, that'll be where you'll probably land, one of those two places. But for Orlando, there's a website, pulseorlando.org. And for Virginia Beach, there's loveforvb.com. And both of those not just are about the incidents, but about the memorials and the
Mhm.
process. And, it's really important for Orlando that we are making regular and high use of that website to keep people informed as the process moves along. So, we may think of a website as 1.0 or something, but
Mhm.
it's a vital thing. People really do care about being
Hmm.
able to go somewhere and bookmark it and find it, and obviously be directed to it by emails and social media and so
Yeah.
on. But to just keep it updated is a huge step forward. So I would recommend folks take a look at those, and I'll send you something to put in the show notes.
All right, Larry, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Appreciated all of your insights, and I think our listeners will find a lot of valuable information in what you shared.
Thanks so much, Kelly, for the space to talk about this stuff I normally don't get to at this level. So thanks for the chance to do it.
All right, as always, thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and thanks again to our generous sponsor, Conveo. Head on over to engagingcities.org, where you can find additional episodes and other helpful resources related to community engagement. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.